We immediately surged to the border.
This past year, we saw the highest number of illegal immigrants ever who were apprehended coming across our border.
There's a rolling humanitarian crisis happening.
The perception is that globally, migrants believe that the border is wide open and that the immigration and border laws are not going to be enforced.
How many bodies are recovered on these pathways? How many bodies are recovered near the American border? There is a lot of death.
You cannot put the politics over the national security of the country. And unfortunately, that's what this administration has done time and time again.
Sky News Australia presents Digital Originals, Biden's border crisis. Every year, millions of illegal immigrants begin their journey into the United States hoping for a better life. The southern border is under extreme pressure as the Biden administration crumbles under the surge. A key political weapon used throughout history and more so in recent years.
We're going to build the wall. We have no choice. We have no choice. Build that wall. Build that wall. So we're going to build it.
What I would do as president is several more things, because things have changed. I would, in fact, make sure that we immediately surge to the border. All those people are seeking asylum. They deserve to be heard. That's who we are. We're a nation that says if you want to flee and you're fleeing oppression, you should come. I would change the order that the president just changed, saying women who were being beaten and abused could no longer claim that as a reason for asylum.
Donald Trump's wall sits barely built along the southern border, with another key Trump policy, Title 42, set to expire in May. This comes at a time that US border authorities are facing extreme influxes of migrants. US border agent sources told Fox News that 1.2 million illegal migrants got away from authorities while crossing the border under President Biden's administration. Monthly border encounters rose from 101,000 in February 2021 to 251,000 in December 2022. And CNN have reported 2.3 million southern border encounters under the Biden administration.
It's all tied to the policies of the current administration. When the Biden administration came into office, they had a program that was initiated under former President Trump called Remain in Mexico, which allowed for an orderly process to those that were claiming asylum. They needed to stay in Mexico until their claims were reviewed and approved. When the Biden administration came in, they decided that they were going to fight Remain in Mexico and not endorse it or enforce it. They also did the same with Title 42, which is a Centers for Disease Control program that was initiated during the pandemic, and they were not enforcing that in its entirety either. So what happened was we had this perception that was created globally that our borders were wide open. And as a result, we started to see the significant surge in migrants making the dangerous journey to the United States.
So when you were working for the DHS, how different does the border look now?
Well, it looks a lot different. And I was working at the Department of Homeland Security as a senior law enforcement advisor for the Secretary of Homeland Security in a Democrat administration under President Obama. And what we did was the asylum laws were enforced. The border and immigration laws were enforced. And what we decided to focus the resources on were those that were in the country illegally. If they were committing crimes, they were immediately removed. So that kept some semblance of order on our southwest border and some form of deterrence to prevent migrants from wanting to make the dangerous journey. As a result, we were deporting over 450,000 migrants a year that were either sneaking in illegally and committing crimes while in the U.S.
Well, the border saw a record 2.3 million encounters in the 2022 fiscal year. Do you think it's because of this messaging, or because there is a Democratic president? I mean, I wonder what it would happen if the Republican president did come into power in 2024.
Yeah, no, I think it's a combination of the policy and the messaging. So long as your policy exists in ways that, like, Biden is trying to crack down on migration now because these numbers are incredible. I mean, we're seeing records for January. We saw a record for December. And he knows that Title 42 is set to expire in May. And so he's trying to preemptively deal with it. But his policies, because he gets hit from the left so hard, his policies still have these administrative sort of bureaucratic avenues for many, many people to just get into the United States. That doesn't mean that they're going to be given amnesty immediately. But it does mean that they're going to be able to cross. And once you're able to cross, because there are sanctuary cities in the United States, because there are ways to evade detection and punishment for having crossed illegally, one of his policies that he just rolled out is you don't get asylum. You're immediately disqualified if you cross the border illegally. Well, there are also tons of exemptions to that. And so as long as you have both the messaging and the policy that we are not cracking down on this, and that we are on the policy level, there are all of these exemptions. People are going to get in, and they're going to keep coming because of that. Their friends, their relatives, they're going to keep coming because they know other people got it. So it's a combination of both for sure.
Emily Jashinsky from The Federalist has seen firsthand the situation unfolding along the border.
The truth is, they'd rather sleep on the street or in overcrowded migrant shelters, scrounging cash and food, paying smugglers, than miss out on the opportunity to get into America and to stay.
We're looking for something very special for living. We got a dream. Okay. The dream for arrive over there.
The American dream.
Yeah, it's a dream for all Asian people.
On the front line, what does the border look like? What did you see?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was last there in June when Title 42, it was still kind of hung up in the courts. There was this idea that Title 42 was going to be gone. People had to get to the border as quickly as they could. And that what you ended up seeing were a lot of people camping on the streets in these border towns in Mexico, waiting just for a chance to get across the other side of the river. They had all paid cartels. It's the one thing that you talk to every single migrant who's hoping to cross the border into Texas, Arizona, or California. They will all tell you they paid a cartel at some point in their journey to make the trip. A lot of them were paying for protection on the streets of Mexico, Reynosa, other parts of northern Mexico. They're paying for protection on a nightly basis just to be able to sleep in the streets or to exist in that city. And everyone knows that if you spend enough time, you are able to hire a lawyer, or at some point the court does something, whether it's with Title 42, humanitarian parole, or any other aspect of America's sort of vast immigration policy through the federal bureaucracy. At some point, there's a very good chance you'll get in. And so the alternative of either staying in your home country or in another country you migrated to before trying to get into America, as is the case with many Haitians, the alternative is much worse from their perspective than sleeping on those streets and just hoping for a chance to get into the United States, because that chance they feel is so strong.
Do you think because of that severity of the issue, all congregating together and then they're waiting on these court dates if they do come about, do you think the estimation of how many gotaways in the United States is a lot more?
That's a really good question. My instinct is to say absolutely, that we have a really hard time grasping the scope of this because, you are also paying, in some cases, the cartels to take you across the border. Now, one way that especially people like Joe Biden, proponents of immigration, would argue, they would say because they have made the legal pathways to seek asylum and to seeking things like humanitarian parole so easy, that we generally know how many people are coming in. But there are still cases where people feel they have to pay the cartel to ferry them over the Rio Grande or another part of the border illegally. I talked to one migrant from Cuba. He had paid $11,000, he said, to go from Cuba into Central America, make his way up. He crossed the border thinking that Cubans were exempt from Title 42. Well, that had changed the day before. He eventually crossed the border again, this time illegally. And I doubt he has been on the radar of the American government at all. So it's really hard to say, but the likelihood that we are underestimating the scope of what's happening illegally with gotaways, I think is very, very high. At the same time, though, we are also tracking more and more. Our numbers are reflecting more and more because the Biden administration has made it so easy to make claims of asylum that have, very little bearing legally. But then people are allowed to come into the country, go to a sanctuary city, and basically stay.
I want to compare the pair between Trump and Biden, because not just from your reporting, but other reporting I've seen, there has been, grabs of illegal immigrants saying that it is easier to come to the United States under the Biden administration. Do you think that it's quite a well-known notion with illegal immigrants that it is easier now?
Yeah, no, that is such a good question. Yes, because as long as the Biden administration gives people humanitarian parole or lets them into our country, doesn't enforce what's called wait in Mexico or other policies. That's part of the problem here is we have these tangled bureaucratic policies that sometimes conflict with each other, sometimes are enforced and sometimes aren't. But as long as people are getting in, what happens is they get on WhatsApp, they get on Facebook, they get on the phone and tell people who are in Nicaragua, who are in Mexico, who are in Honduras or Venezuela, that they got in. And so long as that is being communicated in large numbers, that's going to be all people need, desperate people need. That's the scrap of hope they need to make the trip. And on top of that, cartels do spread disinformation. It doesn't help when their disinformation is fueled by the reality that a whole lot of people are actually getting in, but they spread that through WhatsApp channels, they spread that through the internet, they spread that through Facebook, whatever it is. And so one person who runs a shelter, a pastor who runs a shelter, told us in Matamoros, Mexico on the border, he said, we talk every day or every month regularly with people in the US side and just beg them to send out a message in plain Spanish. That's what he said, in plain Spanish, telling people that if they come, they're not going to get in. And they never do it, he said. He doesn't know why, but he said for years they've been asking for that to be communicated, and it just never is. And that is one of the things that just gives migrants the impression that, they'll be able to, especially under a Democratic president, somebody who doesn't talk about the policy of illegal immigration the way Donald Trump does. That's what fuels this impression that if you come up to the border some way, somehow, at some point, you will get in, because it tends to be true in most cases for most migrants eventually.
Former Department of Homeland Security advisor and former Secret Service agent Charles Mourinho is a recognised security expert.
I think the Biden administration has both a strategy problem and a PR problem in terms of messaging that I alluded to earlier. The perception globally, which if you let hang out there long enough becomes the reality, the perception is that globally, migrants believe that the border is wide open and that the immigration and border laws are not going to be enforced. And for the most part, they have been correct. The other thing is that the Biden administration has never shown the American public what their border strategy actually is. And what we see as a result is we see the Border Patrol, instead of being used for enforcement operations, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, instead of being used for enforcement programs, we see that these two agencies are being used to aid instead the process of migrants making their way into the U.S. So basically, our southwest border has become a huge national security threat here in the U.S. because it's become nothing more than an 1,800-mile processing center.
On the note of, the notion that there is an open border, how does it compare to the Trump administration? Is the Biden administration just not tough enough on immigration?
Well, they haven't been in terms of the Biden administration providing any deterrence to migrants wanting to make this trip. Nor have they worked against the cartels in a meaningful way. I mean, we see that based on the numbers of migrants approaching 6 million. We see that in terms of the fentanyl becoming the leading cause of death between 18 and 45-year-olds. We see it in the human trafficking, the sex trafficking, and we see it in the power that the cartels have attained under this administration. Back to the former Trump administration, again, you saw the asylum laws and system of the United States be enforced. You saw verification of claims for asylum, and you saw a policy and a process by making them wait for their asylum claims to be approved before they were allowed into the United States. Here, under the Biden administration, somebody shows up to the border and claims asylum. They let them into the United States, where they await their immigration hearings for the 5 to 7 years to come. And what happens, Maddie, is these migrants eventually just don't reappear for their immigration hearings, and they disappear within the interior of the United States.
Critics say that when he took office, President Biden, setting the policy, you enforcing the policy, sent a clear message to prospective migrants. He ended enrollments in the program that asylum seekers had to remain in Mexico. He wanted to stop using Title 42 public health protections to expel migrants, and he halted construction of the border wall. Here is the chief patrol agent, your employee, for the Tucson sector. Take a look.
In the Tucson sector, interviewing people post-arrest, what became the most common response was that they believed that when the administration changed, that the law changed and policy changed, and that there was an open border.
Migrants believe there's an open border.
Chris, have you heard some of our political leaders speak about the border and communicate that the border is open? I don't think the more than 1.5 million people who have been removed or expelled from the border would consider the border open, but political leaders communicate that the border is open. That is music to the smugglers' ears, and the smugglers themselves
So wait. You're going to blame this all on Republican critics?
Absolutely not. Absolutely
I mean, you're not
not.
going to say that the administration and the
Chris,
policies on Remain in Mexico or Title 42 or stopping construction of the wall, that had no impact?
Chris, that's not what I said. I'm just citing for you a few things, and please allow me. Number one, they use that rhetoric. Number two, we're dealing with smuggling organizations that are far more sophisticated than they were when I prosecuted them for 12 years as an assistant United States attorney and as the United States attorney. They spread disinformation, they spread misinformation, and the like.
What do you think will happen when Title 42 ends, if it does end in May? Because Greg Abbott was saying that the number could increase by about 18,000 a day, which would be about 6 million a year, which is obviously a lot more than the 2.3 million they saw in 2022. Do you think that this is just going to get absolutely out of control?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons, again, that we went last year, is because there were some signs that Title 42 might end up going by the wayside, depending on what was making its way through the courts and what the Biden administration was going to do. And when you talk to migrants, some of them, not all of them, but some of them actually were mentioning by name Title 42. And that's another thing the media gets wrong. I mean, these are very smart people, savvy people who have made these trips, and they have a lot of agency. They're educated. They know what they're talking about. And so just that fact alone, that they will mention Joe Biden by name, Title 42 by name in so many cases, tells you how much worse that this could get. Now, I think the sort of silver lining is that Joe Biden's trip to El Paso, to Mexico, signifies or it shows us that he's probably worried on a political level about what such a massive influx post Title 42, what that would look like, what that might do to his presidency, because those record numbers, as you said, were an issue in the midterms. The Democrats have not had a good answer to them. And so if he understands that, then maybe some of these policies he puts out will start to get more stringent. He has been slowly, gradually, incrementally adding policies to his sort of roster of approaches to the immigration system. And if he is starting to fill some of those holes, then it's possible that when Title 42 goes away, he's forced to come up with more serious policies, and that's a big help. I'm not super optimistic that's the case, but there are some good signs. There are some signs in the right direction that he understands just on a purely political level that this could be a disaster.
And Title 42, as you know, has been challenged by this administration from the start, similar to Remain in Mexico. Title 42 has never been fully welcomed and grasped by the administration. And as a result, that has aided in the surge in migrants coming to the U.S. But once Title 42 goes away, there will be absolutely zero enforcement on the border. Title 42, even if used at 50% of the time, at least has served as some type of deterrent on the border. But once it goes away, there will be nothing. The Biden administration announced earlier today that they're going to start enforcing asylum claims, which essentially is reverting back to the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico, just not calling it that. However, I think it's very unlikely that they'll actually enforce anything. I think these will be words put on a piece of paper in the form of policy, and I think it represents just how much trouble the president and the administration realize he's in should he choose to run for re-election, and the damage he's done to the Democratic Party on law and order in general in the United States.
The end of Title 42 is an issue concerning Republicans and Democrats at all levels.
This past year, we saw the highest number of illegal immigrants ever who were apprehended coming across our border. Well, Texas is stepping up, and we have done more than any state has ever done. And there's a reason for it. Texans, as well as our fellow Americans, they are furious about the lawlessness caused by President Biden's open border policies. And they should be angry about that. And it's because of that that I declared border security to be an emergency item this session for us to not only address, but to address quickly because of the need for us to be even more proactive to deal with the border. There are several reasons why we need to be more proactive. The upcoming elimination of Title 42 is going to be bringing even more people across our border. It is expected to expire in May. According to federal estimates themselves, they said that once Title 42 is eliminated, we can expect up to 18,000 people crossing the border a day. Calculate that, and that would be more than 6 million people crossing the border a year.
The impact of the illegal migrants surging over the US border can be seen in some of the state's largest cities, now facing an influx of migrants.
The problem of illegal migration in the modern era is just a problem that every country has to face. There's obviously legal migration routes we all have, but illegal migration is something everybody has to deal with because, as I've often said, you either have borders or you don't. And if you don't have borders, you don't really have a country. And New York is just one of the cities that's had to learn this in recent years. A small number, a few thousand illegal migrants were sent up from Texas last year, and New York went into a panic about how to house these few thousand people, which constituted about 12 hours of illegal migration through the southern border. And now it's a few tens of thousands, and the city went into absolute meltdown about it, was putting up, I went myself to see the scenes, was putting up mainly young men in hotels, $500 a night hotels, which were, promptly becoming, pretty dangerous and lawless places. And the city couldn't afford just keeping on putting up every illegal migrant in a hotel, and is now trying to bus them to different facilities. One group is trying to bus some of them to the Canadian border now. But this is what happens when your fantasy meets reality. Democrat politicians and other leftists across America, like in the rest of the world, all have these slogans, about open borders, about no human being illegal. But the reality is, if you allow people to break the law by breaking into your country illegally, there's just all of these problems that come from it. And you can put them off to another city sometimes, but you can't put it off forever.
And those southern states can't really put it off at any time. I mean, they might bus a few of them to New York to send a message, but they're dealing with the enormous influx. The numbers, astonishing, like more than 200,000 a month that they know of, that they encounter. And then there's the ones that they don't encounter. It's absolutely, and I love that line about fantasy meeting reality. That can sum up so much of leftist politics these days, of fantasy meeting reality.
So many migrants face such tough conditions in their homelands, and that is why they are willing to risk it all for the chance of a better way of life.
We have to investigate why all the people have left. Do you understand me? Because no one is going to stop it. Everyone wants to leave. I don't know why. Everyone talks everywhere. I'm leaving for Spain, for Mexico, wherever. People want to leave the country.
But there are many who can't and will continue to do the same. Whether it's by borders, by human traffickers, by sea, by whatever. Cubans have made up their minds, but you can't live here, and they are going to get out in any way they can.
Illegal immigrants are an issue most first world countries will face. In Australia, a water border makes it harder for illegal immigrants to arrive, but it is still an issue. Facing an influx of asylum seekers, in 2013, the then government introduced Operation Sovereign Borders.
The crisis on our borders has become a national emergency. We've had almost 50,000 illegal arrivals by boat. We've had almost 800 illegal boats. We've had 1,000 or more deaths at sea. We've had $10 billion plus in border protection blowouts. The problem is getting worse. This government can't solve it. We are announcing today that under a coalition government, we will swiftly implement Operation Sovereign Borders.
The coalition government had introduced the policy, but in 2023, under a Labor government, the policy remains in place.
As Australia's Home Affairs Minister, I have a warning to people smugglers and anyone seeking to undermine Australia's tough border protection policies. You will fail. Every person who has tried to come by boat has been returned, and you will be too. The Australian Defence Force and the Australian Border Force watch and patrol our borders all day, every day. Make no mistake, Australia's strong border protection policies remain. If you try to make it to Australia by boat, you will end up back where you started, having given your life savings to a people smuggler. You will never settle in Australia.
It is a tough policy that hasn't been without criticism, but the bipartisan support has meant that in Australia it has been effective. In Australia, we do have a bipartisan approach to our border. Mind you, we have water surrounding Australia, so it is a lot easier to handle. But do you think the situation would be helped if both sides of Congress came together and fixed it together?
Well, I think both sides of Congress should come together if they're being truthful with themselves and acknowledge what a threat this is to the national and homeland security of the United States. I think to try and speak about it in any other way is disingenuous. This is truly a threat. The power that the cartels now have based on the billions and billions of dollars that they've been able to make off of the human and sex trafficking and the drugs because of the policies of this administration are readily apparent and evident. So I think Congress should come and work together. I would encourage that, recognize it for what the crisis is, the threat to our national security, and implement the solutions that were working under the previous administration and administrations before. This is not a former President Trump issue. I understand why this current administration wanted to isolate itself from those positions because they're a different party. I get it, but you cannot put the politics over the national security of the country. And unfortunately, that's what this administration has done time and time again. So they need to implement programs that work, and they need to recognize that their strategy or lack thereof is not working.
With Title 42 due to expire, there is major concerns of where the border crisis is heading.
What's different is what's coming across here. It's controlled, but it's not controlled by the Mexican government. It's not controlled by the American government. It's controlled by the cartel. The individuals who cross illegally on this border, in this region, come in camouflaged outfits. The Sinaloa cartel controls who comes across and the amount of drugs that come across. This is a fundamental problem. But it's the problem that's created by this administration. We've only been in the majority for 2 months. The freshman member that I brought here, they have done more in 4 weeks of looking at the border than the president has done in 40 years. The administration, on the day President Biden was sworn in, when you look at the gaps in the wall, why are they there? Why are these lights wired but not working? Because we got a new president that said to stop it. We paid for the metal to go up, but it's stored far away. There's gaps that allow it to come in. That's wrong.
There seems to be no proper big policy in place. There's certainly nothing from a bipartisan level. Where do you see this heading, or what main things do you think the Biden administration needs to put in place starting now so that by 2024, even if he doesn't run, if there's another Democratic contender, what would get voters over the line when it comes to immigration?
Yeah, number one, asylum. The asylum system in the United States of America needs to be dramatically reformed so that it cannot be exploited. And so that you don't get to come into the country in such large numbers and basically hang out because we're so backlogged. And as your asylum case pens for sometimes years, you could disappear into the shadows of a sanctuary city and just hope, like all of those DACA recipients, someday that there's a congressional measure to give you amnesty, which a lot of those things are on the table and might be part of a bipartisan immigration negotiation. And so the people who took that route would have been correct, assuming that someday the amnesty would very much be on the table for them. So the asylum policy, first and foremost, needs to be tightened, needs to be more clear, and you need to have some remain in Mexico policy that is being actually enforced and being enforced, as a category, categorically on all of the people who qualify for enforcement. So that means you need the cooperation of Mexico. It means you need the cooperation of other places in Central America. But if people are coming through Mexico and they want to make an asylum case in the United States, really one of the most effective ways, we actually saw this under the Trump administration, to do that is some form of remain in Mexico so that people can't just come into the U.S. and then never show up for their asylum hearing or whatever else because they're able to make money under the table and be with family when they're here in the U.S. I think part of it also is having a conversation about what's humane in a clearer way, because frankly, the Biden administration's ultra-liberal policies on immigration are not humane, specifically because they're what brings so many people to line the pockets of cartel to make these trips that end up in rape and kidnapping, in some cases death, and actually many cases death. That's another thing the media doesn't like to cover, is how many bodies are recovered on these pathways, how many bodies are recovered near the American border. There is a lot of death. And so those policies that draw people, these kind of pull factor policies as they're called, those are not, frankly, they're not humane. And so I think part of it is just having the conversation and finding a way for Democrats to start thinking about this in that way. So yeah, I agree. I think Republicans, sometimes they'll not talk about this with the humanitarian lens that it deserves, because when you talk to these people, the women and the children, the parents, they just have incredible stories. They want so badly to be in the United States of America, which we've always thought of as the land of opportunity. So I do think you need to combine both of those realities when you're looking at these policies. But at the same time, I also think one thing the American media and American Democrats miss is that it's frankly not humane to enforce this kind of open border, de facto open border, because it's great for cartels who have just created a monopoly on human trafficking in Mexico.
With no proper policy in place, and there doesn't seem to be any bipartisan support on the border, where do you see this heading?
Well, I can tell you this, from the Biden administration, we consistently hear what I call being a false narrative. And that is, you cannot have a secure border in the United States unless you have immigration reform. And that's just blatantly false. It's an outright lie. Immigration reform, while needed, I would argue, certainly, cannot be started until you have a secure border, I would argue. And immigration reform has been spoken about, as you all know, for many decades here in the United States, with an estimated 11 million illegal migrants in the country before this crisis. Now that we're going to be up somewhere around 20 million, it certainly is important. But I'll tell you, when the Democrats in the United States talk about immigration reform, what they're talking about is mass amnesty. And Republicans will never agree to that. So let's start at securing the border. There are policies, programs, ways to do it. History has proven that. And then approach working immigration reform with the Congress in a bipartisan way between Republicans and Democrats.
The House Judiciary Committee is holding hearings into the crisis, trying to find a path forward to resolve the current border mayhem.
If House Republicans go ahead, you could be the first cabinet secretary to be impeached since 1876. How seriously do you take these calls for your impeachment?
Oh, I take them seriously. It is the leadership of the House that provided those remarks. I don't dismiss it by any measure. But what I do is I focus on my work.
What do you think is the basis for their calling for your impeachment? Do you think you've done anything wrong?
No, I don't. I think it is a disagreement over policy, and I think it is used for political purposes to continue a negative dialogue about a migration challenge that is not unique to the United States, to continue that dialogue, to uplift it for political reasons.
So, Mr. Secretary, have you come to a conclusion if these House committees either request you or subpoena you as part of either the investigation or an impeachment proceeding? Have you decided whether or not you will appear before those committees?
I intend to appear when Congress calls me to do so.
Do you think that Alejandro Mayorkas is not speaking properly to border agents about what they need? Do you think that they're run off their feet?
I think during the trips the Secretary makes down to the border, he's received a very tough and rough reception from the troops on the ground, and rightfully so. It's because he's not listening. And, you know, we're talking about a Secretary of Homeland Security who was a former assistant United States attorney in the U.S., then a United States attorney, then a deputy Secretary of Homeland Security under the Obama administration, under the metrics that I told you earlier while I was there. So I know Alejandro Mayorkas. He's a very smart man. There's no way you go from being a United States attorney and enforcing the laws of this country to completely ignoring them as secretary. It's not consistent with the oath of office that he takes, and it's certainly not consistent with the person that I know. So rightfully so, the troops know that he's not listening to their concerns and recommendations, and I think the statistics prove the point.
If you found this production informative, then please like, subscribe and share this video. We also want to hear your thoughts on the issue, so write us a comment down below before you click off this page. I'm Maddie Hale from Sky News Australia. Thank you for watching. Sky News Australia presents Digital Originals, Biden's Border Crisis.